Hello everybody, welcome to the virtual class. Today I'm going to cover chapters 2 through 5 from Mohawk Interruptus. As an overview of the structure of the presentation for today, Chapter 2 provides a historical context or overview for the rest of the ethnography. This is common in ethnographic monographs or books. Sorry, that was a fancy word for a book. Is to have the second chapter be a historical background. What Simpson is doing here is a little different in that she is foregrounding not what she's calling a holistic history, but rather focusing specifically on questions of issues of membership, and her historical discussion is filtered through contemporary questions of membership and who is considered a member or non-member of the nation. Chapter 3 is, you didn't read that, or rather it was an optional reading. It's a critique of older anthropological literatures, especially starting with Lewis Henry Morgan's work from the 1850s. And so this is basically setting up a critique of older anthropological discourses that framed Mohawk peoples as, in terms of static traditions, and timeless traditions, in ways that she argues really obscures our ability to understand contemporary indigenous politics. Chapter 4 then builds on Chapter 3 through this concept of ethnographic refusal. That's really the key concept out of that chapter. Here, Simpson is talking about moments when Mohawk people refuse to participate in the ethnography, when they say, turn off the tape recorder or something like that, as well as her own refusals to say, what is she not going to talk about? What does the reader need to know, and what is she not going to talk about? And for her, ethnographic refusal is an alternative to the problems of these older forms of anthropology. It's an alternative that helps us get through these practices of anthropology as it relates to colonialism and this project of elimination that we've been talking about in the last couple classes. Chapter 5 brings us back to territory, borders, cigarettes, and sovereignty. This is the most ethnographically rich chapter in the book, and so I'm happy for y'all to focus on this chapter if you're struggling with other parts of it. This is a chapter that really focuses on border crossing and the conflicts that happen as Mohawk peoples cross the U.S.-Canada border. Of course, as we've talked about in previous classes, the big concept from this book is the concept of refusal. This is how a lot of scholars draw on Simpson they draw on Simpson's concept of refusal. And I found this really lovely quote from page 112 to 113 that I couldn't figure out where else to put in the book. But she writes, "These nation-states, the U.S. and Canada, have the gall, the mendacity, and the hyperbolic influence to call and then imagine themselves as something other than dispossessing, occupying, and juridically dubious," right? This is that the frameworks, the ideologies through which settler states frame themselves as morally neutral or positive. The political life of indigenous people demonstrates these inconsistencies, these structural flights from morality, and the complicity of capital accumulation with dispossession and race-dominating culturalism. So what she's saying is indigenous politics interrupts these colonial frameworks, the ability of the nation-state, to use language we've talked about in previous classes, the ways in which nation-states represent themselves as internally consistent and coherent. And her argument is that the nation-state is essentially incoherent from the perspective of indigenous politics, or at least an indigenous politics of refusal. And what she says is that this kind of focus on refusal illuminates structural flights from morality, basically the ways in which the United States and Canada, as a society, as systems, as social structures, are organized on flights from morality, are organized on immoral premises. Not just that there are immoral individuals, but this is a structural condition of the settler state. The complicity of capital accumulation with dispossession, pretty straightforward. In order for the U.S. to produce wealth in the U.S. and Canada, settlers dispossess indigenous land bases. Thus, we end up with corporations that we know today. The corporations we know today don't make profit without settler colonialism. And the race-dominating culturalism. This refers to the concepts of race and cultural, the ways in which anthropologists have imagined culture in the past in ways that really interrupt indigenous politics. The idea of indigenous peoples as a cultural group or a racial group as opposed to sovereign nations. This chapter is argued and shown, as will the chapters that follow, that by acknowledging this historical process, both the historical process of colonial violence and indigenous resistance, we might be able to produce forms of analysis that move away from the cultural fetishization and timeless tradition into the ambit of politics and critique that indigenous peoples are articulating. Through this emphasis, Simpson is arguing that through this emphasis, we can move from the problems of anthropology that we've been articulating and will continue to articulate in order to a framework, a study that foregrounds indigenous politics and the critiques that indigenous peoples articulate against settler colonialism. Oh, I forgot to say that in this slide, I just did a Google search for refusals and got really deep into stock photos, so I found a really stupid stock photo for refusal. I think it's hilarious. It's actually very similar to another one I found on an anthropology website talking specifically about ethnographic refusals that focuses on indigenous protest movements, I want to say in Alaska, if I'm remembering where I got that picture from. And it has a woman doing the same gesture, but she has a little phrase in her language, which I want to say is Inupiat, although it may be Inuit. I'm just blanking on where I got that picture. That says enough. Enough is an interesting thing to write because it is a big concept in Simpson's writing as well. So Chapter 2 provides historical context, but with a particular focus on questions of membership and citizenship. One of the big pieces that she discusses in this chapter is Bill C-31. I'm not going to go into super detail about this, but basically Bill C-31 is a bill passed within the Kanawaki government that basically redefined who counted as members and who was given citizenship. And this was meant to be an interruption or challenge to Canada's existing previous Canadian policies regarding who was eligible or not for quote-unquote Indian status, to be legally recognized as First Nation. What the organizing question of this chapter is what are the terms of recognition? Essentially, how do Mohawk people recognize one another? Not just how are they recognized or not misrecognized by the settler state, but how do Mohawk people recognize one another? How are the terms by which Mohawk people recognize one another debated or contested? How are Mohawk people debating who's a member and who's not a member? And how have the terms of these debates changed over time? This chapter foregrounds questions of race, gender, and membership, the ways in which Mohawk identity has been reconstituted by settler states as a racial category, as well as by Mohawk, what's the word I'm looking for? Systems of governance, right? Bill C-31, in which membership is organized according to blood quantum, the idea that you have to be more than 50% Mohawk to be, considered a member of the nation. This plays out in a lot of gender and gender ideas as well, in terms of the history of Canadian policies that did this weird thing where Mohawk women who married men lost their Indian status, but Mohawk men who married settler women, those settler women suddenly became Mohawk status. And so there's these complex issues of gender in terms of this legacy of women who've been cast out from membership according to these legal categories of recognition, and the ways in which Bill C-31 seeks to interrupt that. In terms of the issue of racialization and blood quantum, this is a complex set of issues because in many ways blood quantum is a colonial category. When I talk to Creek folks in Oklahoma, they often say, oh, blood quantum is a colonial category. It's imposed externally. It doesn't really mean anything. These are, of course, more leftist-leaning Creek people who tend to be... I don't ask me how I ended up in the fucking leftist queer part of Oklahoma, but that's what happened. On the other hand, there's other people, and there's other scholars like J.K. Alani Kawanui, who argues that in the context of Hawaii, for example, blood quantum was used to deny Native Hawaiians access to land. Essentially, there were legal frameworks developed by the colonial government of Hawaii, or the state of Hawaii, to saying that in order to be eligible for land claims, you had to be more than 50% Native Hawaiian, which basically opened up a lot of land for settlers. But there's also scholars like Kim Tallbear, who's a Dakota woman, who says the thing is that blood quantum is imperfect, and it's certainly a colonial imposition, but it's something that's relatively good, because on the one hand, we've been dealing with it for a long time as indigenous people, so we understand how it works in a fundamental way. We understand the problems and the limits. But also, when I say, I'm 25% or 50% Dakota, I'm talking, that's my mom. When I say I'm 25%, I'm blanking on the other, has ancestors in many different indigenous nations, and I'm blanking on what the other nations are right now. But when I see 25% this other nation, that's my grandfather, right? So in her mind, these percentages stand in for specific family members. So there's this issue of blood quantum is hotly contested within indigenous communities. And Simpson's overarching argument when it comes to these questions of how Mohawk people debate membership and who's a member and who's not and who should be a member, she says that what we need to understand in order to really understand these debates is the history of territory and dispossession. I'm not going to read this whole quote. You can pause the video and listen to the quote. Read the quote if you want. Or you should, do that. Because just for the sake of time, I'm not going to read it out loud. As well as because this was in the worksheet from last class. One of the things that Simpson does in this chapter is she points out that contemporary Mohawk people are obsessed with this question of membership. Who should be a member, who shouldn't be. Mohawk people are talking about it all the time. But if you look at the history, this is kind of strange. Because 150 years ago, Mohawk people were incorporated what would today be considered outsiders into their communities pretty regularly. And they did this through the clan structure. And so the idea is identity, whether or not you're Mohawk versus a settler or whatever, that's not a problematic ethical issue. It's not confusing. It's political membership, right? It's about incorporating people into belonging within this political and familial kinship organization that was the Mohawk Nation. However, that history today is perceived to be a problem by contemporary Mohawk folks. It appears to have created a situation that has led to what a lot of people see as cultural loss. Now, as anthropologists, we should be skeptical of narratives of cultural loss. I'll get to that later in this article. But it is something that indigenous peoples talk seriously about, and it's an important part of indigenous politics in ways that do matter. However, Simpson's argument is that we're far too obsessed with this idea of cultural loss, when really what we should be focusing on is land loss and the loss of sovereign rights as nations. And if we center this as opposed to cultural loss, we can go further and see deeper into the issues of the quote-unquote membership problem. This quote deals with a lot of similar issues as the previous quote. Again, pause it, read it through. So in the last quote, Simpson is arguing that this issue of the way the problem is framed in terms of cultural loss is actually problematic, and we need to focus on land loss and the loss of governmental power, sovereignty. Here, in this quote, Simpson articulates what she calls a historical inverted position on membership. This is really the organizing problem of the chapter. This is the question that organizes the chapter as a whole. How is it that Mohawk people went from a situation where 150 years ago, membership was not problematic? People could be easily incorporated into the clan structure, into the system of governance. But today, membership is a problem. How do we account for this complete inverse of orientations? And the way she phrases this is really quite lovely. Now, when we talk about this dynamic, one of the things Simpson points out is that the concepts we have available today to talk about Mohawk politics 150 years ago actually don't make any sense in that context. They're anachronistic. So we can talk about the ways Mohawk people were able to integrate outsiders or racially different peoples, creating a multiracial or multicultural community. However, the problem is that these concepts are actually colonial concepts in themselves. They're concepts that are not actually relevant for Mohawk organization, Mohawk politics 150 years ago. So it's not that Mohawk people were able to incorporate people of different races into their community or incorporate outsiders into their community. It's that these very concepts run counter to the organizing principles of Mohawk politics at that point in time. And as she says, as sovereign political orders, these First Nations took, bartered, naturalized, killed, and loved according to their philosophical and political charters before the biopolitics and race became unambiguous techniques of settler sovereignty and governance. This difference, this logic of integrating outsiders into the community, was not problematic until the construct of race became important. And that's something that happened historically later, as she shows in this chapter. Race became an issue at the time when being Mohawk became being Indian, and being Indian carried rights. That's a lovely little phrase, right? Because what she's saying is that there's a conflation of being Mohawk with being Indian, this idea of a category of Indian as opposed to Mohawk. And that actually reflecting a transformation in people's identities. And suddenly being Indian carried rights. This is the issue of the liberal politics of recognition critiqued in previous classes. The ways in which settler states began to, as a result of indigenous politics, recognize certain limited forms of sovereign rights and treaty rights by indigenous peoples. Suddenly becoming Mohawk became being Indian, and being Indian meant carrying rights. And as a result, race really starts to matter on the reserve. Chapter 3 is a critique of older anthropological discourses, starting with Lewis Henry Morgan, who I'll talk about in a minute. And Simpson has this lovely quote where she says, "Here I want to move the understanding of settler colonialism into the ambit of specific area studies," basically indigenous studies in this context. Indigenous studies, Black studies, Asian American studies. So we can see how indigenous elimination holds hand with disciplinary formations, which is evident in the way anthropology does or does not study particular cultural groups and why. What she's saying here is that she wants to think about how anthropology, quote unquote, holds hands with colonialism. That's a lovely quote. And how this kind of practice of holding hands has situated anthropology and the object of anthropological study. In other words, culture. She continues, "The intent here is to understand how we come to know not forms of difference in the geopolitical place of the present. No, we're not forms of difference. How do we know these people? How do we imagine them as insignificant or as significant or significant in particular ways or simply different? So what she's asking is what are the politics that undergird what early anthropologists studied, what cultural dynamics they focused on or analyzed, which peoples they thought were worth studying or not worth studying and why. But also, she's critical of the culture concept itself, the ways in which we understand people to be different or not different. Likewise, the ways in which cultural difference becomes the object of study, instead of what she would prefer, which is politics and specifically indigenous sovereignty in relation to settler colonialism. And so she's talking about the history of anthropology here, and she's going back to Lewis Henry Morgan's book, The League of the Iroquois, published in 1851, right? So we're talking 150 years ago. This is fucking a long time ago. Lewis Henry Morgan worked with Eli S. Parker. Parker is a Haudenosaunee or Iroquois man, in order to create this book that's often thought about as one of the first ethnographies, one of the first examples of anthropology or an anthropological study. And Simpson writes, what this story demonstrates is that the literature on the Iroquois is a realization of early anthropological desire, a desire for order, for purity, for fixity, and for cultural perfection that at once imagined an imminent disappearance immediately after or just within an actual land dispossession. This is the crux of Simpson's critique of early anthropological practices and earlier ethnographic practices. Basically, anthropology reflects a set of desires, or what I would describe as there's an object of study, which is cultural difference. And the idea is to organize the world according to a schema, a framework of different cultures that are different, and ordering those cultures on a map, literally saying this is where this culture is, this is where that culture is, giving it boundaries, ordering it in space and in time. This is about purity, it's about fixity, and Simpson's argument is that it's deeply tied to these logics of elimination. On the one hand, anthropologists are imagining indigenous peoples as being about to disappear. On the other hand, they're operating in the context of within or just after actual dispossession of land. So going back to Lewis Henry Morgan, he's a really interesting case study here. Because the thing is, Morgan was an advocate. He did a lot of advocacy work on behalf of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. And in this context, one of the things he was arguing, one of the things he believed was that members of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy should be granted citizenship within the United States. He thought so because the way he understood the world, Iroquois people, or Haudenosaunee people, were highly civilized. They were ready to integrate into white civilization. And for him, that was a good thing. However, it also meant, for him, integration or assimilation into white civilization, into the settler state, would also mean cultural loss. He might have actually used the word social evolution, because that would have been the framework in 1851, but the idea is that there would be a loss. And that he had a role, he and Eli Parker had this role that involved documenting Haudenosaunee traditions, understanding what was Haudenosaunee life like before settlers arrived, for the sake of posterity. So here we see Lewis Henry Morgan occupying this really problematic but interesting position that illustrates Simpson's point, right? He's articulating a desire to know an authentic Haudenosaunee culture that is prior to European influence, in the context because he imagines Haudenosaunee culture or Haudenosaunee ways of life, because the culture concept hadn't been invented yet, as being about to disappear, even as he's writing in the context of actual land dispossession, which is a dynamic that often gets left out of his writing and the writings of early anthropologists. Because the idea was that this cultural loss was a natural result of proximity to white civilization rather than a function of colonial violence. So this sets up Simpson's critique of what she calls the way anthropology and culture and anthropology and colonialism holds hand, or the way anthropology and this practice of elimination holds hands. Early anthropologists imagined Haudenosaunee and represented Haudenosaunee people as well as other peoples as fixed, as being located in particular geographic places, and not moving, as static, culturally static and timeless traditions. The idea was to represent or know culturally pure or authentic cultural authenticity. And the idea was authenticity was located in the past. It was located prior to European influence. And European influence was seen to contaminate indigenous ways of life, to make them less pure. And so anthropologists weren't trying to study that kind of influence. They were trying to study this kind of imagined purity that existed before. Now, there's many problems with this. First of all, when I say the concept of cultural purity, that should sound a little Nazi-ish to you. It is a little Nazi-ish. Actually, both Nazis and early anthropologists were drawing on the same underlying philosophers. Herder, who was a German philosopher who imagined not culture, but national culture. Now, back when Herder was writing that, didn't have the exact same Nazi overtones that it later had. Some people would argue that Hitler really bastardized that concept. I don't know if I would say that, but the point is that these concepts change over time. And this German word that's national culture, forgive my shitty German accent, American anthropologists took that and created the culture concept. German scholars went and studied, like, the Brothers Grimm, right? They were studying folk traditions. So they created a book full of folk traditions that became the Grimm's whatever. You know what I'm talking about, I hope. That was a function of this concept of national culture. And then Hitler took it and talked about racial purity. But there is a kind of underlying pattern. So when I talk about cultural purity, that should raise a bunch of red flags as being vaguely Nazi-ish. It also ignored that, for example, Haudenosaunee peoples had been interacting with peoples over big spans of difference, right? Different nations. For a long fucking time before Europeans had showed up on the scene, right? This idea of authenticity is like, what point in time are we trying to imagine? Are we imagining Haudenosaunee people at 1610? At 1513? At 1412? At fucking 5000 BC. And the idea, anyway, I'll just stop there. It also represented the objects of anthropology in terms of ritual protocols. This is how you do this particular ritual, da-da-da-da-da. And the underlying ideology was that indigenous, as I said before, authentic indigenous lifeways were disappearing in the face of white civilization. Thus, anthropologists need to document this information before it was lost for the sake of posterity. Chapter 4 is Simpson's answer to the problems she raises with early anthropologists in Chapter 3. The key concept that comes out of this chapter is ethnographic refusals. That's important. Make a fucking note of it, please. And she opens this chapter and says, to speak of indigeneity is to speak of colonialism and anthropology, as these are the means through which, indigenous peoples have been known and are sometimes still known. That's a lovely concept, right? Or that's a lovely phrasing, right? To speak of indigeneity is to speak of colonialism and anthropology. You can't speak of indigeneity without also speaking of these other two dynamics, because the history is so entangled. Ethnographic refusals is how she deals with that entanglement. This is basically similar material as the previous chapter, but She phrases it in a really, I think, powerful way here. The problem with these early anthropological representations is they obscure contemporary politics. And really, this is a problem with the very concept of culture. I forgot to mention the map that I showed in the previous slide, but if you go back a couple slides, you can look at the map. What I was illustrating with the map, right, is the way, this is a map that was drawn by Lewis Henry Morgan, and the idea was to represent how different cultural groups existed within geographical space, right? Think back to what we've been talking about mapping and colonial power. It became important to map the spatial territories of different cultural groups in order to know them, to govern them better, and to preserve this information for posterity. So when you look at these maps, don't see a neutral representation, see an anthropological artifact, an anthropological representation that doesn't necessarily reflect indigenous realities. Because on the one hand, when we focus on these kinds of bounded territories, we lose sight of movement. We lose sight of the way people move between these places, the way people travel, trade, and fuck, right? So basically, Simpson says the problem with these kinds of early concepts of culture as bounded and fixed in terms of static traditions is that it obscures the complicated bodily and exchange-based relationships that enabled marked colonial situations in empire: warfare, commerce, sex trade, missionization. So it obscures both the larger context of colonial politics, as well as the ways in which people interacted with each other across cultural difference. And the idea, right, is that these cultural concepts, they obscured those dynamics, and what they focused on identifying was a difference that had been contained into a need, what she calls an anthropological need. I'm sorry, that's a typo. In favor of a difference that had been contained into a neat, ethnically defined territorial spaces, right? The idea that cultural difference can be ordered in space according to neat, ethnically defined territorial spaces that need to be made sense of, ordered, ranked, governed, and possessed. Anthropology in this sense is essentially a logic of rationalizing cultural difference in space for the sake that that difference can be governed and possessed. Now, as she notes, this is very different than what contemporary anthropologists do, in which accounting for empire and colonialism is very much central to doing good anthropology today. And I just want to flag that, right, because I know with Simpson and myself and other scholars, it's easy to say, fuck anthropology is the worst, which is actually not unfair. But it is important to note that for contemporary anthropology, accounting for the problems of early anthropological representations and accounting for empire and colonialism is very much central to doing good anthropology. That's why we're talking so much about this stuff in an anthropology class, right? So, throughout these last few slides, I've been really articulating Simpson's critique of the culture concept. And why is this important? It's important because, as she says, concepts have teeth. I love this phrase, right? Cultural concepts have real political effects. They have teeth. Part of it has to do with how is indigenous life legible or illegible within colonial orders of governance? What forms of life can colonial governments recognize and what gets misrecognized? She points to a long history of these issues, such as the concept of empty land in Australia. The idea that native Australians had not labored in such a way to produce agricultural fields or marked the land in ways through their labor And as such, the land was empty. There was no system of land tenure or ownership. And because of this, European governments felt justified in appropriating all that land for the settler state. And it wasn't until much later in time that the Australian government, pretty recently, right within the last few decades, that the Australian government has begun to recognize indigenous land tenure systems. Arguably, I'll say from a place of cynicism, the ability of the settler state to recognize indigenous land tenure reflects a place of deeper stability of the settler state and an expansion of colonial power, not a reduction of it. Right? The settler state is now ingrained enough that it can recognize that indigenous peoples did have systems of land tenure. Another issue, too, though, is even this framework of land tenure, right? That's a colonial concept. That's a Eurocentric concept that we're using in order to make indigenous lifeways legible to colonial orders of governance, in order to situate indigenous land claims, right? By saying indigenous peoples had a system of land tenure, what we're saying is we're making indigenous lifeways intelligible, recognizable within the logics of colonial governance. These logics, we can go back to Locke and his theory of private property. Locke's theory of private property was that people enact labor on the land, and by enacting labor, they come to own it. And for Locke, any civilized society has a notion of private property based on this concept of laboring, of mixing in labor with natural resources. Now, I'll come back to this in a minute, right? But when I say any civilized society for Locke had this concept of private property, the other side is that savages, primitives, did not have this concept of private property. So this concept of private property and labor actually opens up indigenous landscapes for dispossession in a material way, in a violent way. So concepts have teeth. Likewise, the concept of culture is a concept with teeth. It's a concept that is actually pretty embroiled within colonial orders of governance. And her critique is that culture is defined in proximity to difference, not in proximity to sovereignty. That is such a concise, beautiful, deep critique right there. Underline that in your note, in the book. And she writes, that difference was to be defined against the sameness and omniscience of a stable ontological core, an unquestioned self that defines difference, and thus culture for a readership, one that corresponds to a metropole and a colony, a self and another. All right, that's a really complicated way of saying European anthropologists were overwhelmingly European, not entirely, yet the way in which anthropologists imagined who they were was in relationship to Europe, in relationship to the colony, the metropole, London or New York or Washington, D.C., right? And the audience was supposed to be educated white settlers, overwhelmingly, right? And so difference was to be, the ways in which anthropologists came to define difference was difference from middle-class European settlers. That is what Simpson means by the stable core of the self. This goes back to the question we were dealing with in a previous week, right? What happens when you deal with the reality that indigenous peoples are sometimes anthropologists? How do you do anthropology as a black, indigenous, or person of color, as a member of a colonized nation or citizen of a colonized nation? And what makes that a powerful question is it's not just about having this particular body with black skin or brown skin makes you do anthropology different. It's that we actually have to deconstruct and problematize the underlying racist and white supremacist logics that have historically formed anthropology as well as the rest of the university system. We're dealing with institutions that were not made for black, indigenous, and people of color. So it's deeper than skin color, right? It's about race as a cultural concept. It's about colonialism as a system of social organization, not individual bodies. So what's a Mohawk anthropologist to do? This is where Simpson comes up with her concept of ethnographic refusal. This is her answer, right, to these problems. An ethnographic refusal refers to the tension between what you need to know and what I refuse to write. Basically, she is intentionally refusing to write things for political reasons and saying, you fucking don't need to know that. I don't know who you are. You don't need to know that. This is information that is real and important to Mohawk people, and it's not for you, necessarily. And when Simpson talks about ethnographic refusals, right, she's asking, can I do this and still come home? What am I revealing here and why? Where will this get us? Who benefits and why? So what she's asking, right, can she write this material? What can she write while still being able to face her family and friends at home? What are the goals of her book? Does this enhance Indigenous sovereignty? As, for example, Darren Renko says it should? Or is it doing something else that's not actually necessarily relevant to Mohawk people? Who benefits and why? So an ethnographic refusal is that moment that's where people say, enough. It's when her interviewees shut down or told her to turn off the recorder or told me outright funny things like nobody seems to know, when everybody does know and talks about it all the time. Dominion was exercised over these representations when it was determined that enough was said. So in this sense, an ethnographic refusal has two meanings, right? It refers to the moments when her interviewees refused to talk any further about a subject. When they said, we can talk about it, but turn off the recorder. This is an act of sovereignty, right? Of enacting sovereign power or force over what gets written into the ethnographic record. The other side of ethnographic refusal is what Simpson, as the ethnographer herself, refuses to write about. You may notice that she is not writing about religious or ritual protocols within the Mohawk community. She is writing about the politics of refusing the settler state. She is refusing to write about the kinds of topics that were historically central to anthropology as a colonial project, and she's trying to do something else. So what is sovereignty? Here's a few different ways. What is ethnographic refusal? Here's a few ways she seeks to define it. A practice of sovereignty as moving away from discursive containment. I love this idea of discursive containment, right? Because it relates so much to Sanjay's work and the role of schools and other state institutions as a logic of capture that really reproduces the plantation, right? Really reproduces these plantation dynamics of who is allowed to be a full citizen and who is not. But for Simpson, she's talking about discursive containment, the ways in which early anthropologists imagined their objects, imagined indigenous peoples as existing within geographically contained spaces. We can also think about containment as a colonial policy, the limiting of indigenous peoples to reserves and reservations, depending on if you're in Canada or US, which term you would use. Right, so her idea is that it's enacting sovereignty as a move away from fixing people in space and within timeless traditions imagined as part of a more authentic past that's now being lost. Anyway, I love this concept of refusal as an interruption, as a practice of sovereignty that interrupts discursive containment. Ethnographic refusals do not presume indigenous lives and politics are on equal footing with anyone. Basically, what she's saying is when she represents Mohawk people, she's trying to do that in a way that acknowledges the real inequalities that they face. It does not presume indigenous lives and politics are on equal footing with anyone else. And she says refusals speak volumes because they tell us when to stop. That's just such a beautiful phrase. Refusals speak volumes. When people refuse, that is ethnographic material. It's not the ethnographic material we were asking for, but it is ethnographic material because it tells us when to stop. And this is really an interesting practice, right? Can you take a refusal and write a whole volume on it? Can you write a book on the practice of refusal? With chapter 4, Simpson brings us to border crossings between the U.S. and Canada. This is really the ethnographic meat of, what a weird fucking metaphor, the ethnographic meat of the book. This has the richest ethnographic material. In order to understand these border crossings, we need to understand the Jay Treaty of 1794, described in more detail on page 133. The Jay Treaty is what defines the border between the U.S. and Canada, and it also recognized indigenous peoples living on that border area as having the sovereign rights to move back and forth across these borders. Those movements are protected by the Jay Treaty. Simpson's argument is that the border becomes a site for the activation of Mohawk sovereignty. It's a place where Mohawk people activate their treaty rights under the Jay Treaty, saying, I can move between this space as an indigenous person because I belong to a sovereign nation that was here prior to the United States and Canada. On the other hand, she also writes that the border crossers in this chapter are viewed as aberrant because they interpret and deploy their own sovereignty in ways that refuse the absolute sovereignty of at least two settler states, and in doing so reveal the fragility and moral turpitude of those states. So Simpson is bringing us back to this concept that I brought up from a previous lecture of settler fragility, the idea that the basis of the settler colonial order is actually quite fragile because it is premised on this assumption of sovereignty, of being able to control borders. And yet here are indigenous peoples crossing these borders as members of sovereign nations within that geographical space that are not necessarily governed in the same way as settler citizens usually are. This is a lovely phrase, right? So basically she's arguing that the act of crossing the border is about, it's a refusal to recognize the absolute sovereignty of the U.S. and Canada. As such, it reveals the fragility of those nation states. This is a picture from a previous, I think I showed you this picture before, right? We didn't cross the border crossed us. Simpson has this lovely quote where she shows this ethnographic vignette of crossing the border and the kinds of issues and problems dealing with border agents who don't necessarily have a deep understanding of the Jay Treaty. And how do you navigate as a Mohawk person these border crossings in that context? She also talks about the social construction of smuggling as criminal activity. She notes that the Jay Treaty protected Haudenosaunee people's rights to trade things like tobacco to other indigenous peoples across these borders. And so what we have in the 90s is this mass hysteria about the problem of tobacco smuggling in between U.S. and Canada. And the way this history played out, it was framed as a problem because it was a problem for tobacco companies, and it was a problem for the U.S. and Canada to collect taxes. And so in this way, right, there was this whole controversy that was about that constructed Mohawk border crossings and exchanges of tobacco as smuggling, or practice of selling cigarettes across the border as smuggling. And what Simpson says is obscured or missed in this larger context, in this debate, is the larger context of Iroquois trade practices and treaty interpretations across borders. The recognition of indigenous sovereignty. I was just doing a kind of silly search for You Are an American and seeing what turned up. And what I got was this funny little quote with the picture of a beach for some reason. Being an American is about having the right to be who you are. Sometimes that doesn't happen. What a funny quote to think about from the context of indigenous border crossing, in which Audra Simpson is told, "You are an American," and she says, "No, I'm not. I'm Mohawk," and she gets into an argument about this with the border guard. The thing about indigenous refusals is they challenge the foundational basis of settler states, the founding organizing assumptions of settler governance and identity and belonging. Okay, so Simpson also gives us a bunch of historical context in order to understand why these border crossings matter. I'm not going to go deep into it, but she does talk a lot about, because of the sake of time, I am going too long. But a lot of this has to do with the contradictory requirements of what it means to be Indian status or a status Indian in Canada and the US, right? This is about what it means to be legally recognized as a Indian, Indian being a legal category here. It has to do with the history of racialization, the ways in which indigenous peoples have been historically reframed as a racial category as opposed to members of or citizens of sovereign nations, and the ways in which that framing of indigenous peoples as a racial category is tied to the erosion of treaty rights and sovereign rights. And we have the conflation of indigeneity with lawlessness, i.e. the idea that the savage exists outside of civilization. We see this in Locke's discussion of private property, the idea that civilized nations have private property, whereas non-civilized people by definition do not, or savages by definition do not. Savage is kind of a funny term to use here because according to the scientific discourses of the time developed by, once again, Lewis Henry Morgan, the proper term for the Haudenosaunee, according to 19th century categories of science, which we will now recognize as being super fucked up, is not savage, but barbarian. That was a little bit of a tangent, very tongue-in-cheek. Please don't quote me saying Haudenosaunee people are really barbarians, or your racist professor said that Haudenosaunee people are barbarians. Very much a racist category that was contemporary for 19th century science, anthropological science, developed by our favorite Lewis Henry Morgan. Anyway, the point is, right, there's this logic of conflating indigeneity with lawlessness as being outside of the law. We see this not only with Locke, not only with the conflicts over... Okay, so Simpson also gives us a bunch of historical context in order to understand why these border crossings matter. I'm not going to go deep into it, but she does talk a lot about, because of the sake of time, I am going too long. But a lot of this has to do with the contradictory requirements of what it means to be Indian status or a status Indian in Canada and the US, right? This is about what it means to be legally recognized as a Indian, Indian being a legal category here. It has to do with the history of racialization, the ways in which indigenous peoples have been historically reframed as a racial category as opposed to members of or citizens of sovereign nations, and the ways in which that framing of indigenous peoples as a racial category is tied to the erosion of treaty rights and sovereign rights. And we have the conflation of indigeneity with lawlessness, i.e. the idea that the savage exists outside of civilization. We see this in Locke's discussion of private property, the idea that civilized nations have private property, whereas non-civilized people by definition do not, or savages by definition do not. Savage is kind of a funny term to use here because according to the scientific discourses of the time developed by, once again, Lewis Henry Morgan, the proper term for the Haudenosaunee, according to 19th century categories of science, which we will now recognize as being super fucked up, is not savage, but barbarian. That was a little bit of a tangent, very tongue-in-cheek. Please don't quote me saying Haudenosaunee people are really barbarians, or your racist professor said that Haudenosaunee people are barbarians. Very much a racist category that was contemporary for 19th century science, anthropological science, developed by our favorite Lewis Henry Morgan. Anyway, the point is, right, there's this logic of conflating indigeneity with lawlessness as being outside of the law. We see this not only with Locke, not only with the conflicts over. This brings us to Simpson's concept, and I love this phrasing, settler panic. Settler panic is really tied to what she talks about in terms of the precarity of settler states or the fragility of settler states. The idea that settler states are actually formed on a very unstable, precarious basis. And in this quote that I have, this long quote, Simpson is critiquing colonial narratives about quote-unquote smuggling and Mohawk practices of quote-unquote smuggling. And the problem, as it's framed within these colonial discourses, is a failure to recognize an international boundary that's been drawn through the water. It's a failure to deal with, it's what she describes, or it's an anxiety, let me start over. The problem is that Mohawk border crossings refuse to consent to colonial mappings and occupations of their territory. These colonial mappings referring to international boundaries between settler states. And it's this refusal to consent to colonial mappings that what she describes as incites the anxiety about the containability of Indian bodies and practices. I love this, right? The idea is that settlers need to be able to contain Indian bodies and practices. They need to be contained within bounded and fixed cultural areas. They need to be contained within the boundaries of settler states. This is really gets us to the heart of the governance of nation states, right? It's about containing and counting bodies, populations as belonging or not belonging within fixed territorial boundaries, within international boundaries. And so she describes this as a kind of Mohawk countermapping, a countermapping that exceeds the colonial maps of international boundaries. And as she says at the very end in the bolded section, it's simply Indians' perceived misrecognition of boundaries and the inability to contain their trafficking and their economic practices that appeared to be the issue. When smuggling is framed as a problem, when Mohawk practices are constructed as smuggling, the problem appears to be Indians' failure or misrecognition of international boundaries and a failure to contain their trafficking and their economic practice that appears to be the issue. It's their failure or refusal of containment. Again, I think there's a really powerful resonance here with Sean Jay's work. How do we, in terms of how we understand the settler state as a practice that's fundamentally premised on capture in terms of the plantation and anti-black racism, as well as containment in the context of settler colonialism. These twin structures of the nation state, at least in the context of the United States. The plantation and settler colonialism. So I have this meme for you, right? White people saying Skoden isn't real. Skoden is an indigenous meme I'll explain in a minute. And indigenous people responding, neither is Canada. And white people freaking out. Right, so the meme here, the joke is that Canada isn't real. It's a bunch of fucking imaginary lines drawn in the sand that we collectively organize our lives and practices as if these imaginary lines had meaning. Again, thinking about Sean Jay's definition of the state as not a system, not as institutions, but practices. So what is Skoden? Skoden is a meme, right? And the joke is that settlers often freak out about what Skoden means. And here's an article from Walking Eagle News, which is an indigenous-run joke site. It's like The Onion. This is not real news. It's a joke, right? But it's poking fun at this kind of common response in settlers to freak out about Skoden. So the headline is Non-Indigenous Readers of Ontario City Terrified After Skoden Message Appears on the Water Tower. And they have this quote from this imagined settler who says, I just know that those indigenouses are behind this. If you ask me, it means they're planning some sort of uprising. And the joke, right, is that settlers are always like, I don't know what it means, but I don't like it. It's scary. So what does Skoden actually mean? Skoden is something you say in response to when someone says studis. They say studis, you say Skoden. This is a slang form of the longer phrase, let's do this, which gets shortened to studis. The response to let's do this is let's go then, which gets contracted to Skoden. Studis, Skoden. Let's do this, let's go then. So the joke is that this is this totally fucking random indigenous meme that settlers freak out about that incites this condition of settler panic. And maybe there's a deeper context in here in terms of Simpson's critique of anthropology, the idea that indigenous peoples need to be rendered knowable, legible, recognizable to settlers, because if they're not recognizable, they can be a threat. But, for Simpson, this idea of settler panic is fundamentally tied to the deep precarity or fragility of the settler state as a form of governance that requires, at its foundation, the subordination and containment and elimination of indigenous modes of life. Mohawk people refuse these practices of elimination and insist on their sovereign rights to cross boundaries under the Jay Treaty. These are some discussion questions to give you some structure in terms of talking about the material. If you would like to talk about something different that I haven't asked about, go ahead and go for it. I love that. I know I say this every time, right? I'm here trying to give you structure. If you want to go in a different direction, go for it.